As the number of states legalizing medical and recreational marijuana grows all across the country, as you can see right there on that graphic, there are new questions about the impact it has had on crime and traffic deaths.
In his new op-ed, our next guest argues researchers are purposely finding ways to minimize the impact. Here to explain is former New York Times reporter, the author of Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence, Alex Berenson. Alex, you're back. The numbers are pretty astounding in terms of what's happened in Colorado, aren't they?
Yes. So in Colorado and Washington, which are the first two states to legalize recreationally, dispensaries opened in 2014. Since then, the number of driving deaths is up about 30% in those two states.
But you can't quantify that it went up because of marijuana.
Well, unless
the number of deaths are just
unless
high.
you actually count every death. But actually, there is data showing that the number of deaths. This is the data is better in Colorado than in Washington. The number of deaths where people had THC in their blood in a fatal accident has more than doubled in Colorado. So that's actually a pretty good indicator. The problem is that
isn't this the argument that people were making before they legalized it?
Yeah, and it's a big argument. It's a big argument right now about whether, in states like New York and New Jersey that are talking about legalization. By the way, the worst traffic accident in the last decade, the upstate New York limo accident that killed 20 people, the driver had no alcohol in his blood, only THC.
So is there a way to test out in the field like we have the breathalyzer?
At this point, essentially, no. They're working on stuff, but there's no test. And the other argument, unfortunately, around driving is that people say, well, if you smoke a lot, you develop a tolerance, so there can't be one standard as there is for alcohol. I personally think that's a really bad argument, but it's an argument.
But here's an example of a pushback. In the Seattle Times, they write, no increase in violent crime that can be directly attributed to the marijuana legislation.
So violent crime, driving, both cases, the same stuff has happened. There is a bunch of researchers out there who are ignoring the top-line data. So the top-line data for driving, the top-line data for crime, it's in the book. It shows, well, not driving, but crime, I go into in great detail in the book. Deaths are way up, and there's a bunch of academic researchers who are just ignoring this.
So why do you think they are trying to minimize the impact?
I think, unfortunately, there's an ideological bent towards legalization, and it's caused people to ignore the data. There's a guy at the University of Oregon named Ben Hansen who's done a couple of studies, and instead of looking at the broadest data set, he sort of pulls data from here and there. And by the way, sometimes even that shows an increase, as it does with driving data. And instead of acknowledging that, he says, well, if we look at these confidence intervals, we can still say it's similar. He's basically not acknowledging the top-line numbers.
Well, that's crazy. Also, I think money has a lot to do with it. There's so many rich people or so many businesses now invested in marijuana.
Invested in marijuana. But the other thing is there are people who've made donations to places like the Brookings Institute who are in favor of legalization. And unfortunately, I think that's infected the research.
He has written a great book. It's called Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana. Alex Berenson, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, good job, Alex.